was initially attracted to study perfection in the Bible out of curiosity. But the more I studied it, the more compelling the topic has become because it morphed into something a little bit different in what I call human wholeness. Discovering that God's vision for his human creation is in fact not perfection. It's a misleading idea and a bad translation in the first place. And what he's really after is that we be whole, flourishing human beings that he created us to be. So it's really a positive and I think a compelling vision that the Bible has that I have become even more attracted to as I've studied and written about it. I suppose my first musings about the topic of perfection or wholeness occurred when I heard texts like Matthew 5:48, be therefore perfect. There must be something really deep going on there, I thought, at least on the surface, because it sounds nuts. I mean, after all, who is perfect? And then listening to sermons in churches and later studying theology, I discovered that my broadly evangelical Protestant tradition made quite a big deal of being perfect. If a human being failed to keep God's commandments perfectly, then they were a sinner. The final judgment will not be graded on a curve. 98% won't cut the mustard. It's 100% or nothing. That's true biblical righteousness. I came to understand that's what God is after. And this explains why all of us need to be saved. And this is all tied to the concept of perfection. So I was more than a little puzzled as I began to study a little more deeply in the topic, interested in an influential study of Paul and Judaism that asserted and argued persuasively that neither the Old Testament nor Jewish teachers like Paul ever suggested people had to keep the law perfectly in order to be right, okay, in God's sight. The more I read and studied, the more it seemed a solid consensus of serious students of the Bible had come to this conclusion. And this book is my attempt to let other students of the Bible kind of walk along with me in this discovery. Reading through the First Testament, I'm sure I'd read passages like Job 1:1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. The man was perfect and upright. But it somehow had never really registered on me what this was claiming, perfect. In fact, I discovered there are a whole host of folks in the Old Testament who are described this way. But it's also pretty clear throughout those texts that they were anything but perfect. So it makes sense that most modern translations have moved away from the word perfect or perfection in describing these folks. Now they're wholehearted, they're genuine, they're whole, they're complete, blameless, etc. But they're no longer perfect. Lo and behold, just as I always thought, nobody's perfect. But what exactly are they if they're not flawless and perfect? And here I made a second discovery, that they are described as righteous, true, faithful, authentic, whole human beings. They walk with God on the path that He has laid out, themselves full of flaws, waywardness, and weakness, but nevertheless, they are described in these texts as being what God has always desired and designed. In Hebrew, the word is tamim, often used here, which means whole or complete. What some Bibles mistranslate then as perfect, which is where our confusion has come in. Neither the Old Testament nor God Himself had ever envisioned flawless behavior from such frail creatures of dust. They expected people to walk with God, do that wholeheartedly, to do that in trust, to turn back to Him when they wandered from this path, which they would inevitably do as weak and frail creatures. And a fair portion of the book just unpacks what this means in the biblical texts and then for our lives and our theology. So if God doesn't expect me to be flawless, what does He expect and how does this work out? This expectation is in some ways pretty simple. He expects us to walk with him. He said to Abraham, "Walk before me, be faithful and be tamim, be whole." And the word tamim and shalem is a related word in Hebrew. They simply refer to something that conforms to its design, to the intent of the one who made it. And in this case, God, who made people. What is the intent? And his intent is that we follow him, that we walk with him, that we enjoy life and fellowship and the caring for creation and for one another. And all of this is what it means to be tamim. So when Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, closes that sermon in chapter 5 with, "Be therefore," teleos in Greek, almost surely tamim in his original language, he's saying, be that which God has always designed his human creation to be. Not something sort of inhuman, flawless, perfect, angelic almost, but normal human beings who walk with him, who foul up, but who turn back when they discover that, when God taps them on the shoulder. The problem, of course, people might say, well, isn't that a little bit loose on sin, as though it doesn't matter? Not at all, because what matters is the heart and the direction of the life. So if you're walking and you walk off the path and you walk the wrong way, you turn to the right or the left. If you continue as a life pattern in that other direction, and you don't wake up and you don't repent, or in Hebrew, turn back to the path, that is a real problem, and God is serious about that. But he's serious about the heart and where we're headed. I would say not as concerned about every little foul up that we commit, but the direction of our heart. It was actually a surprise to me to discover how personally meaningful this topic became. It started out as more of an intellectual and theological curiosity factor. For me, there's been a much more enjoyable and relaxed character to my walk with God. Falling short of perfection isn't necessarily a failure. It's a part of the reality of being a frail creature of clay. It doesn't mean that I ignore sin, ignore error, but it can be dealt with. I don't need to get quite so uptight about it, and I don't think God gets quite so uptight about it as I used to feel. It's also helped for me to ease a number of theological difficulties. For example, will the final judgment really be according to our deeds, according to the life we've lived? As Paul and the whole Old Testament tradition teach, if the standard for that judgment is flawless 100% obedience, it probably won't turn out very well. But if the life God is looking for is actually within the grasp of weak creatures who hang on to him for dear life, then this consistent faithfulness with its ups and downs, maybe faith and deeds can actually fit together quite well. So readers of the book should probably realize this is more a book of biblical and theological and historical investigation, less a how-to book of Christian living. There are, I think, a lot of expressions of how this investigation impacts our lives, what human flourishing might look like in some exemplary ways. But the book doesn't really delve in depth into exploring how might that look in human life. That, I think, is probably a next step. And there's actually, interestingly, a great deal going on right now in Christian theology and reflection on the topic of human flourishing. And so this book really ties in with that developing trend in Christian theology and writing and provides, I think, a little more biblical underpinning for that.